Thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Welcome to Hyros Gamos Radio, broadcasting out of the Lower Triangle, Tasmania, the descending tongue of grace, adrift in the freezing waters of men between mainland Australia and Antarctica, howling like the hanged man while practicing pramayana with a head cold. Hyros Gamos is the sacred wedding of matter and spirit, life and art, Thelema and Tao. Our guest is a leading academic in the fields of Southeast Asian religions, the origins of yoga and magic, Keith Cantú. Well, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Your entry point into this work, was it via the East or the West, Crowley first or yoga first?
You know, that's a good question. I'd have to say Crowley. Besides a funny Yogi Bear T-shirt that my mom had that represented a bear doing postural yoga, I virtually had no awareness of anything yoga growing up. Instead, I first encountered yoga in high school around 2004, 2005 via texts on the AA student reading list, especially the Hatha Pradipika and the Shiva Samhita. I also owned a paperback copy of Israel Regardie's Golden Dawn book and had a smattering of knowledge from online metaphysical forums and open source meditations on the tattvas. But soon after, I was exposed to Crowley's Liber E, which, as you probably know, also contains some yogic teachings. But I really didn't understand anything at the time and eventually had to suspend my studies of magic and with it yoga for several years. Only encountering it again after traveling to India and engaging the works of John Woodruff or Arthur Avalon.
So what is yoga? The word is ubiquitous in the West now, but can you look past that and define it by your own understanding?
Right. So yoga comes from the Sanskrit root yuj, which literally means to yoke. But of course, as you probably know, the word has meant several different things according to the time period and context, even today. From the Patanjali Yoga Shastra onward, that's Patanjali's Yoga Sutras with their bhashya or commentary, the term yoga came to mean the cessation of the turnings of the mind, that is, yogas chitta vritti nirodha. And the scholar Philip Maas has dated Patanjali's text and its commentary to between 320 and 400 of the Common Era, and as such, it's one of the earliest definitions we have, apart from early hints in the Upanishads onward. Several centuries later, after Patanjali, as scholars like Jason Birch and James Mallinson have pointed out, a new form of yoga called Hatha Yoga, or the yoga of force, started to develop, likely first in a Buddhist milieu and later among the Nath yogis, about whom both David Gordon White, Gordon Georgievich, and many others have written. Associated with this was also Raja Yoga, or the Yoga of Kings, which, as Jason Birch again notes, was part of a fourfold system that also included Hatha Yoga, Mantra Yoga, Laya Yoga. And here, Raja Yoga was a part of this as a kind of deep samadhi, or meditative absorption. And so, as you mentioned, kind of it's ubiquitous in the West. The popular connotation of yoga as merely postural practice is relatively recent, as demonstrated by authors like Mark Singleton, Elizabeth de Michelis, and Suzanne Newcomb. And the scholarship is really out there to kind of trace this trajectory of how modern yoga sort of departs with, but also continues certain aspects of the past.
Well, what is magic for you? Why is it still hard ask for academic research?
Right. Well, magic with a K, for me, is exactly as one of Crowley's classic definitions puts it, the art and science of causing change in conformity with the will. This definition is largely unique to Thelema, however. In academia, there exists a large body of theoretical scholarship, especially in the fields of religious studies, anthropology, and sociology, where the category of quote, magic without a K has meant a wide variety of things, as evident from the works of James Frazer to Emil Durkheim, Marcel Mauss, Max Weber, Claude Lévi-Strauss, Stanley Tambaya, and many others. I think this ambiguity is what makes it difficult for academia to accept, and understandably so. For instance, Lévi-Strauss took it to mean something like techniques that fail to produce a verifiable effect. And so it kind of became this useless category that ought to be avoided. And magic in academia, I think, remains, from that point, still kind of a mixed bag, though there are some scholars who are trying to clarify the situation. I think scholars would be more willing to accept Thelemic magic with a K if it were similarly recognized as this kind of emic category that is of relevance to a sociologically significant group of people alive today.
It's quite a relevant thing, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
It's also, I guess what you're saying is it's big and broad and messy, perhaps. But so are a lot of other disciplines. Why would that be? I mean, like, for example, perfect one is art. It's ask the question, what is art? It's the same kind of question, what is magic? Though one is accessible for education, in the mainstream education, one is a lot less so. Why do you think so?
Yeah, I think it really is that it's been kind of tossed around by theorists who have attached several different definitions to it. So it's become very difficult for academics to agree on kind of an objective definition of magic that can be worked with. And so instead you have contemporary scholars like Bernd Christian Otto and Michael Stausberg, who have kind of tried to clarify magic as more of an emic category, sort of unique to a tradition, such as medieval grimoires. And I think that while objective conversations about the meaning of magic, just like art, is very important and relevant, I think that academics might be more willing to accept Thelemic magic if it's recognized as a specific category within a tradition that has its own discourse and definitions.
Okay, yeah. So about maybe having a better understanding of defining it, perhaps.
Right.
Yeah. Before talking to you, I obviously, Googling you, and found that paper of yours that had that was about a proposal for a department of magical disciplines, studies. That's it. In universities. I thought it was brilliant. Would you like to talk about that, just to add on?
Sure. So I had drafted that paper for a seminar that was related to kind of sociological aspects of studying religion, and I noted, getting back to one of the earlier questions, that so many theorists had talked about magic, but that there's no real magical studies department, whereas you have, these same theorists are talking about religion, and you have, many departments that are devoted to the study of religion. And so in reformulating that into a conference paper, I started to think about, okay, well, this category of magic, should be analyzed and examined more thoroughly. And there's even a way in which, interestingly, non-Western scholars will use magic to apply to international traditions. You see this in South Asia, for example, where some Bengali authors will refer to magic in the context of Buddhism or Hindu Tantra. And often, though, this idea of magic is kind of uncritical, right? It's not really thought about what exactly magic means, and sometimes it's dismissed as like black magic or this and that. And I think that having a more kind of established basis to talk about magic can help, although it still runs the risk of being a vague concept in many ways. So it's a push and pull that I often find myself.
Also, magic's really quite a free, very individualized, personal thing that that perhaps it could get the magic itself could get stamped out of it if it became a bit too formalized, perhaps.
Right, and I think it could be very easy to dismiss magic with a K in kind of the intellectual exercises of trying to define magic without a K.
Your research extends to Southeast Asian religions, but also medieval Europe. Why is that? Are you simply following your passions?
Yeah, I feel kind of called out a little bit. So I took Latin as a foreign language in high school, and to be honest, ceremonial magic has always fascinated me. So yes, I'd have to say a good deal of it has to do with my passions. Recently, however, I've come to realize that texts traditionally seen as Western grimoires, like the Picatrix, for example, are actually Latin translations and modifications of Arabic texts. So there's often kind of a wider spread of astrological and alchemical knowledge that these texts reveal. And there's another point, which is that while my dissertation is more centered on South Asian than medieval European history, many of the personalities who figure into the picture are well-known actors in the academic field of Western esotericism, including Crowley, and had a deep knowledge of medieval alchemy and ceremonial magic as gleaned from European sources. So it's been nice to attend classes and colloquia here at UC Santa Barbara and expand my knowledge in that direction too.
Would you say that they there's much variance going on? I guess you were talking about how that when you go far back enough that you realize that it comes from different scripts and things that in South Asia as well as opposed to Europe, if there's much of a difference within their religious and spiritual practices, or whether it's really quite aligned. What would you say?
Yeah, it's difficult to say. I think there's definitely cultural specificity to many of these traditions, and they obviously are operating within a very specific and historical point in time. But as you say, if you go back kind of in the history, it's possible to trace certain ideas, like, for instance, the astrological decans, or the divisions of the zodiac. There's a way in which certain ideas can be traced from sources that kind of travel over time and across linguistic barriers. Alchemy is another example. So.
Well, can you tell us what you've uncovered in terms of your research into Begali Sufism?
Yeah, absolutely. This could go many directions, but the short of it is that Sufism in Bengal over the past several centuries has interacted heavily with Buddhist and Hindu yogic traditions. And so it represents a highly syncretic form of Islamic mysticism that at times even steps beyond Islam itself. And so an example of this are the Baul fakirs of Bangladesh, who Carol Solomon, a scholar, has written on in depth. And their songs, especially those of a figure named Lalon Fakir, reveal a unique synthesis of Hatha Yoga that includes everything from references to Kundalini, to Perso-Arabic letter symbolism of letters like Aleph and Lam. And there are also references to Zahir, or exoteric truth, and a Batin, or esoteric truth, which is sometimes in the songs associated with the figure of Mansur al-Hallaj, the 9th century Sufi martyr. So there's kind of a very interesting interplay that in some way to me even mirrors Crowley's own syncretism of blending certain Semitic traditions like Hebrew Kabbalah, for example, with its letter symbolism, with techniques of yoga.
Well, tell us about, we'll try and pronounce this one correctly too.
That's okay.
Śrī Sabhāpati Swāmī. What led you to him, and why do you think he has been overlooked, in generally speaking?
Yeah. So Śrī Sabhāpati Swāmī, you got the pronunciation pretty good. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Glad I did.
Yeah. he was a 19th century Tamil Śaiva yogi from Madras, which is now modern Chennai. And he wrote prior to Swami Vivekananda and had interacted with Helena Blavatsky and Henry Olcott, some of the early members of the Theosophical Society, although he was later dismissed by them and his writings were discovered by Crowley. I had first heard about this figure, who we could even say SSS for short, in Crowley's works. And after tracking down one of the Swami's own works in English, I at first mistakenly wrote him off as kind of a typical Vedantic author. But then later I was asked by Michael Coulson of Horizon Lodge in Seattle to translate some of his Sanskrit terms for a project, and discovered that there's something really huge here that has been overlooked by academia, with a few exceptions. And the reasons for this neglect are many, but I think that mostly the yogi's dismissal by the Theosophical Society, as well as some other figures, kind of led him to become more of a pan-Indian rather than an international figure. And that also the Raja Yoga of Swami Vivekananda, which was published 6 years later, after it kind of eclipsed some of Sabhapati Swami's works. And so, only now scholars are trying to examine with a fine-toothed comb the roots of modern yoga. So I think that his best days are still to come.
So you're saying that things haven't yet been uncovered, so to speak. Would you say that they haven't quite got... Yeah.
Definitely, especially his vernacular works. So there's works that are still extant in Sanskrit and Tamil, for example, which they haven't been translated yet.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Do you think that's something that will happen in the near future, or is it's a long task? What?
No, I hope so. That's really where my research is focused of late. So I'm hoping to work on that with some other people in the field.
You mentioned SSS, alluding to Liber HHH. Are you being sneaky?
Well, halfway sneaky and halfway. Michael Coulson, who I mentioned in the last question, he likes to refer to Sabhapati Swāmī as SSS as well. So it's kind of an easy way in communications to get that across. But you're absolutely right to mention that Crowley was also perhaps being sneaky by alluding to that in Liber HHH. So, yeah.
So can you talk about the intersecting points of traditional yoga and the Thelema? So we've kind of had a broad discussion. Can you give us some more points about those intersecting points?
Sure. Honestly, I think the best general overview for this is found in Gordon Georgiewicz's chapter, The Great Beast as Tantric Hero. And that's found in the Oxford volume, Aleister Crowley and Western Esotericism, as well as his own book, India and the Occult. So I would only further emphasize, as Gordon also recognizes, that SSS also plays a significant role in Thelemic literature. And this is also true with regard to the AA, where, as Hymenaeus Beta noted in a footnote to Magic, the revised second edition, one of Sabhapati's embodied meditative techniques were annotated by Crowley, and then they were incorporated into this ritual. So I think that there's a lot of fruitful material still left to be discovered and understood in that direction.
What impulses or modes of practice do you think most influenced Crowley's approach to yoga?
So I'm sure there are some listeners out there who have practiced yoga, within the AA and or OTO for much longer than I have, and probably have a more complete answer. But that being said, I can partially answer this from a historical point of view. We know that Crowley and Alan Bennett traveled to Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, in 1901, and a diary exists of them both studying yoga, or it reflects their studies of yoga under Ponnambalam Ramanathan, who was then the Solicitor General of Ceylon. So I think Crowley especially valued these techniques of asana, pranayama, and dharana, and also incorporated the 8 auxiliaries or limbs of Patanjali, as well as bhakti or devotion, jnana, knowledge or gnosis, and Raja Yoga, according to their prevalent definitions in the early modern period. Crowley also integrated certain conceptions of a yogic or subtle body. And so, for example, Krzysztof Azarovitz has been working on the questions of the attributions of the chakras to the OTO degrees, and has also analyzed the extent to which J.F.C. Fuller also contributed to this side. So I think that it's difficult to say what was most influential on Crowley, but there's at least several indications there.
Say, for example, Crowley's description of the second stage of pranayama being automatic rigidity. That doesn't exist in any of the source material that I know of. Can you talk about these particular innovations?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think maybe the reference to Liber Ru vel Spiritus, that's something that I definitely should look into more. The question of automatic rigidity and some kind of more innovative techniques that Crowley incorporates into yoga, such as also this kind of link with ceremonial magic and in postcards to probationers and elsewhere. I think that some of that may be from kind of oral traditions or teachings that he received on the ground. And this notebook, this kind of 1901 diary, is really notable since it proves that he wasn't getting his techniques of yoga just from texts or published established sources, but also having conversations with people on the ground, not only in Sri Lanka, but also in South India, in Madurai. And so while there are definitely some innovations, and he took it in, another direction that, is unique for the time, there's also the question of, well, how much of it is new and how much of it is kind of more oral techniques that just haven't been found in written sources as of yet.
From that, would you recommend anything for people who would like to explore yoga any further?
I definitely would pull out Liber E. Liber E, well, I think it's Exercitiorum. And that text has fascinated me for a while now, and especially just kind of the simple technique that it offers of kind of rotating the breath with the nostrils. I think a technical word for it is nadi shodhana, that some kind of modern yogic practitioners use today, and the idea that you can kind of inhale and then exhale and hold the breath for a certain amount of time. I think simply that practice alone is a great introduction, as Crowley recommended it for daily use.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, what were the subtle body ideas, getting further into this one, mystic anatomy and tantric papers that Theodore Roos was working on within the early formation of the OTO? How have they been integrated into our corpus?
Right. So a key paper that articulates this is Royce's essay, published in the Oriflama, entitled Mystic Anatomy. But I think this was published before Building Stones for the OTO Temple, which was a later work, at least one or maybe several years later. However, even in this paper, Building Stones, we can see kind of key references in the bibliography to some of Royce's influences, such as we see the Bhagavad Gita, but we also see references to Karl Kellner's essay on yoga, and that includes material from Sri Shachandra Boshu's editions of the Shiva Samhita as well as the Giranda Samhita. So there's kind of a clear trajectory that we can even trace to the very edition and the compiler of a given work where these ideas were coming from. And I think the Shiva Samhita especially warrants more attention as a key text for the OTO. But Royce also cites the Hatha Pradipika, though erroneously attributed to Patanjali. It should be Svatmaraman. But then add to this the works of Franz Hartmann and Hargrave Jennings, and I think you have a pretty solid trail to follow. I'm specifically grateful to Steve King or Frater Shiva for sharing with me his forthcoming edition of some of Royce's papers, as well as the importance of Hargrave Jennings to Theodore Royce's Mystic Anatomy. So I think the Jennings connection is something that really could be explored more.
The next question is, how has your research influenced your own personal practice? But also, how has your own personal practice influenced your research?
Fair enough. To be honest, I've always been an immersive learner. However, researching a lot of this material in depth in the context of religious studies has made me discover the practical importance of trying to maintain a separation, at least publicly, between my academic work and my personal life and practice. This is often a kind of a given in European academic circles, but it's a little more blurry at US universities and in the academic contexts. I'm not sure how it is in Australia. Maybe you could touch on that.
Yeah, I guess it depends on the department that you're in, really, I think. And also, I guess, the nature of what you're interested in. I guess this is, of course, a little bit more on the down low than maybe being interested in basketball.
There you go. Yeah. So, that being said, I don't think it's ever possible to fully separate influences between the two. Especially if we take, Crowley's idea that magic can be as simple as picking up the pen and writing a book. It's hard to fully ever separate, the research from personal practice. But at the same time, the public maintaining of that separation can be very practical.
With the publication of Aleister Crowley and Western Esotericism and a number of other academic papers published in recent years, how would you say that Crowley is presently reviewed in the hallowed halls of establishment academia?
I think the efforts of Henrik Bogdan, Marco Passi, Gordon Georgievich, who I mentioned earlier, Richard Kaczynski, I could give many other names. And there's junior scholars like Manon Hedenberg-White and Anastasia Alexandros. These scholars, I think, have done much in their work to encourage a more balanced and nuanced treatment of Crowley in the light of what we know. And Aleister Crowley and Western esotericism is a big part of that. Unfortunately, many scholars still rely on critics who are unabashedly negative in their assessment of Crowley and thus make sweeping generalizations that are not grounded at all in the primary sources or even extant notebooks, correspondence, diaries. And so I think more could be done to balance the kind of study of Crowley, and that academia still represents an open frontier where the possibility exists for, these negative opinions to change. For instance, I'd love to see scholarship on Crowley's relation to Taoism or Sufism, or even a dissertation on his relationship to Jewish Kabbalah or ceremonial magic. And so I think the door is still wide open for fruitful research on Crowley and his legacy, as well as for sociological studies on Thelema as a whole. I think there's a lot of potential there.
Do you see those notions shifting and changing in the near future, or do you think this is something that will take a while to work at?
I see them shifting in the near future, most definitely, as more openness starts to arise with, the emergence of fields like Western esotericism, for example, and for kind of comparative approaches to religion that take into account South Asia and occultism, for example. You have kind of a movement that way. And I think that as people start to sincerely engage some of Crowley's literature, it becomes necessary to really take them at face value and to kind of engage with all of the sources that he himself was putting together and pulling in this composite approach. And I think we've really come a long way from simply, dismissing something as syncretic or dismissing something as, modern innovations of whatever kind, and really trying to see, well, what exactly was going on? What was being practiced, and what were the actual historical, trajectories that were being carried out? And I think those are important kind of objective questions.
I guess time and distance can raise the objectivity more so as well. Perhaps that's
right.
In particular with Crowley's case as well, that as time goes on, it will become a historical thing more than something that people perhaps have a personal investment in, that is.
Right, or a vendetta against.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
right. I thank you very much for this opportunity, and I really appreciate sharing some of these aspects and listening to these questions, and I hope it can be encouraging.
Yeah, it certainly is. I really hope it's encouraging for everybody who's listening too. And we're very thankful to have you on the show, for sure. Absolutely. We hope you've enjoyed the show. None of the opinions expressed by hosts or guests reflect the policies of OTO Australia, its members, or officers. This is your host, Sora Mer. Love is the law, love under will.